This particular story was originally chosen for a program for high schoolers in a Spanish class. I believe I also told it to a few ESL students and a Spanish literature class, high school age. Now, some of the humor is of the sort that I think some younger listeners or readers may not understand, but I believe it's mostly acceptable for all ages. I believe that almost all ages would enjoy it, at least to some degree. And so here's this tale, Clump of Basil. Um, Once upon a time, there was a tiny town in the middle of nothing and nowhere. Now this town wasn't too small because it did have a king, and this king loved riddle games. He loved them so much he went out into the town every single day and told one of the villagers a riddle. Now most of the time, because there was this misconception that kings would chop off their head if they answered incorrectly, most of these villagers ran away, particularly into their houses or workplaces, after the king sprung on them this particularly intelligent riddle, or at least so he would think. Now, in the same town, around the edges, further away than the king normally went, there was a baker, and this baker had 3 daughters. He also had a garden, and in this garden he had a large clump of basil. Now, basil is a herb, and it has quite a number of leaves. It's very green and leafy, at least it was at this time. Now, every single day one of the daughters would go out and water this clump of basil. So, on the first day that the king finally made it out this far to the edge of the town, the oldest daughter was watering this clump of basil. And as she watered it, the king rode up and said, "Lady, grant me your best appraisal. How many leaves in your clump of basil?" Well, so startled and not exactly sure what to say, she raced back into the house. Well, the king left, and the next day he came back, but this time it was the middle daughter, the second daughter, who was out there watering this clump of basil. And he said, "Lady, grant me your best appraisal. How many leaves in your clump of basil?" Well, this daughter too was so startled that she ran into the house. Well, the king was okay with that, and he raced back to the house, back to his kingdom. Now on the third day the youngest daughter was watering this clump of basil, and as the king rode up he called out, "Lady, grant me your best appraisal. How many leaves in your clump of basil?" And she smiled and replied, "Lord, grant me your best reply. How many stars are in the sky?" Now the king had had 2 free days, 2 days where the ladies raced back in the house, blushing and hiding their faces. Now this time it was his turn to be so surprised that he raced off on his white horse all the way back to the castle. Well, of course he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let her win. So the very next day he rode down to the town all the way through it until he reached the baker's house. And there was the youngest daughter, and he called out, "Lady, grant me your best appraisal. How many leaves in your clump of basil?" And she said, "Lord, grant me your best reply. How many stars are in the sky?" And he, having thought of this all night, said, "You with your answers so smart and handy, how many kisses did you give for candy?" Well, people didn't talk to women like that in those days, and she knew exactly what he meant. So she, embarrassed, raced back into the house with her head covered by her hands. So he, having won, rode off. Now you would think that he would come back the very next day and this game would continue, but you'd be wrong. Unfortunately for our young king, he became gravely ill. Now days passed, and then weeks passed, and then rumors started spreading down through the castle into the town, saying, "Our king is going to die soon." Well, the youngest daughter couldn't let this go on for long. I mean, she could, but that would result um, in losing this game. And that was simply not acceptable, at least not to this young woman. So one day, around midnight, perhaps 11:30, 12:30, she clothed herself all in black, in a black cloak that covered her face, in black clothes that covered her hands, and in black shoes that covered her feet. And then she went and she tied up a mule that her father had, and walked that mule all the way through the town up to the gates of the castle. Now the castle guards took one look at her, decided that this was death, and that they could not mess with death, no matter if they liked their king or not. They were not going to stop death. They didn't even ask anything of her, so she simply walked through those gates, up those stairs, into the royal chambers, and stood over the king's bed. Now as she stood, she waited for him to wake up, and this didn't take very long, because even ill as he was, she had quite a presence, being death and all. And she said, "I'm sorry, my lord, but you have no more time. It's time for you to go with me. You have no more minutes, no more hours, no more days." Now, like anyone would, especially a young king, he said, "Oh, no, 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 there must be something I can do. Do you want money? Do you want riches? What can I do so that I don't die?" And she said, very happy that this cloak kept him from seeing how she smiled, "Oh, well, perhaps there is one thing that you can do. You see this mule here? Well, each time you lift that mule's tail and kiss it right below, you will gain a year." Now the young king, ill as he was, didn't even question this. He threw himself onto that mule and kissed it so many times that neither he nor the young woman knew exactly how many times he kissed. Now after a time she said, "Okay, that's enough. You've done enough. You will not die, at least not now," and left. Now this is perfectly fine, because she left, and the king got better. It took a few weeks, but eventually he was back up to his old pranks. He came right around that baker's house, was right where that young woman was watering that prized clump of basil, and said, "Young lady, grant me your best appraisal. How many leaves in your clump of basil?" And she said, "Lord, grant me your best reply. How many stars are in the sky?" And he said, "You with your answers so smart and handy, how many kisses did you give for candy?" "Clever, my lord," she said, "but answer without fail. How many times did you lift a mule's tail?" Well, this was something that no one should have known, and so surprised was the king that he raced all the way back to the castle. But even as he did, he thought, "This woman is wise and clever. I want her for my wife." But of course this tale couldn't end without one last riddle game. Now the king wanted this young woman for his wife because she was smart and cunning, but he couldn't just tell her that. He had to give her one last test. So he called that baker up to his house and said, "Baker, I want your youngest daughter for a wife. However, she must come to me neither naked nor dressed, neither riding on a carriage, nor riding on horseback, nor simply walking. And if you do not follow this to a T, then she will die, and so will you. I will chop off both of your heads." Now the baker, who was not quite as clever as his youngest daughter, it's presumable that she got this from her mother, had no idea what to do. He thought of this, he thought of it, he rolled it around in his head, but he never got an answer. So at one point he finally told his daughter, "The king wants your hand in marriage, but he gave us this riddle. You have to come up neither naked nor dressed, neither walking, nor riding in a carriage, nor riding on horseback. You must come up some other way." And she said, "Don't worry about it. I know exactly what to do." And so she went down to the water's edge, because this town was near a bay, and she grabbed rolls of netting and stripped herself of her clothes, then wrapped herself in those nets, so she was neither dressed nor naked. And then she looked at the mule that she had had the king kiss, tied a rope around her wrists, and then around the head of that mule, and slapping it on its rear, had that mule lead her all the way up to the castle. Now seeing this, the king was quite pleased, because she was neither naked nor dressed, neither simply walking nor riding in a carriage or on horseback. And from then on they lived happily ever after. And that's the end.